All right, welcome to part 3 of the Wordle tutorial. So we'll just continue right where we left off. So the next thing we need to do is start setting up our board. So over here inside of the board blueprint, I'm going to add a couple variables. So the first one is going to be the word length, and we're going to make this an integer. And then we're going to check these checkboxes here. So I'll really quickly explain what these do if you don't know. So private is just makes it so it's only accessible inside of this class. Expose on spawn, you'll see this in a minute. When we actually go to spawn the board, it will make it so that the variable is exposed right inside of that node. Blueprint read only is just because it's never going to change. It just gets set once and we never want it to change. And then instance editable, you need to check this if you have expose on spawn checked, otherwise it just won't work. So that's what those are. And then also we want to make one for the number of guesses. Let's call it num guesses, and make sure you duplicate the word link so you get all these checkboxes for that one as well. And then compile, save. And then in our event graph here, we want to just delete everything except for the begin play. That's the only thing we need. And then I'm just gonna make a function to keep this simpler, and I'm gonna call it initialize board. And then we'll make this private. And then off of the begin play, we'll just call initialize board. All right, so inside of here, we want to spawn the board with all the tiles, and we want it to be whatever size it needs to be based off the word length and the number of guesses. So let's start with looping over the number of guesses, because this is how many rows we want. So drag this in, and we actually want to do -1 here, and then we're going to do a for loop. Make sure you get this one down here, not the for each loop. We want just the normal for loop. And we want to go from 1 to the number of guesses -1. And then we're going to make this a local variable and just call it the guess index. And then I'm just going to put local after it so we know it's local. And then we want to do the same thing for the word length. So drag in the, actually just going to copy this right here, paste, and then I'm going to replace the word or the num guesses with the word length. And then I'm going to make this a local variable as well and call it the letter index. And again, I'm going to add local here so we know it's a local variable. If you don't know what local variables are, they're basically just variables that get created and destroy every time the function is called. So they're useful whenever you want to just have variables that are only, well, local to the function. I don't know how else to explain it. All right, so now we're looping over our guesses and our word length. So this is basically the number of, like I said, the number of rows, and this is the number of columns. And we want to spawn a tile for each one of those. So the next thing we need to do before we can continue writing this is to make the tile blueprint. So back here in our content folder, right click, make a new blueprint class of type actor and call it BP underscore tile. And then let's just save this again for now, and then go back to our board and say spawn actor class. And the actor we want to spawn is our BP underscore tile that we just created. And then I'm going to split the transform so we can set this more easily. So we just need to calculate where this thing is going to go. If you remember, we want it to go at this being the top center of the board. So to get that, we want to drag in the scene location of where the top middle of the board is. And we want to say get world location. And then we want to offset this both left and right and also down depending on which row it's in and which column it's in. So we're going to take this and we're going to do an add here. And then we want to take this node and split it because we want to modify the y value, which is the left and the right, and the z. So the y value is going to change depending on which column it's in, and the z is going to change depending on which row it's in. So for the y, we're going to use the word length. So drag in the word length, and we want to add to this, or sorry, we want to divide this by 2, so that way we can get the middle. And then we want to take the letter index, which is our local variable here, and we want to subtract these like so. And then we want to take this value and multiply it by whatever the size of our tiles are. So I'm actually going to take this integer here and convert it to a float. And then we want to make variables for the size of our tiles. So over here on the left, we'll add a new variable and call it tile size. And I'm going to make this private and blueprint read only, and compile, save this. And then here you can put whatever size the tiles are going to be. Now we haven't actually created the tile blueprint yet, but once I create them, I'm going to make them a size of 100. So I'm going to put 100 here. And then we also want to have one more. So right click and duplicate this tile size and call it the padding size. Oh, and sorry, these are supposed to be floats. So change this to a float and also change this one to a float. And the padding size is basically the padding or the amount of space between the tiles. So you can just put it like 10 or whatever you want it to be. And then we just want to add these two together. So drag in this one, and say add. And so this is what we're going to multiply it by. So the tile size plus the padding size is essentially the size of a whole occupation of a tile. And that's going to go into our y value, which again is the left and the right offset. And then we just need to figure out the z offset. So that's going to be based off of the number of guesses, which is the row. So we'll drag in our current guess index. And again, we will do a multiply. And we want this to be a float. And again, we'll take this value. I guess we can just drag this down here like this for the padding and the tile size. And then we also want to multiply it. So hit this little plus button one more time here and put a -1 here. We also want to multiply by -1 so that they go down, right? So they're going down from the top. And that's going to go here to our z. And then this is going to be our spawn transform for that specific tile. And then for the rotation, we just want to use the world rotation of this socket here. So we'll just say get world rotation, or not socket, I mean this scene component, like that. And then finally, after that, we want to take this and we want to add it to an array of tiles so we can keep track of them. So I'm going to right click on this and say promote to variable, and we will call this tiles. And I'm going to come up here and change this to be an array. And I'm going to change the variable type like so. And then just refresh this guy. Or actually, we can just delete this guy and drag him in again because we actually need the get. So we're going to say get, and we're going to say add. And we want to add it to our array. So as we're spawning these tiles, as we're spawning these tiles, we're adding them to this array. All right, so now let's go work on the tile blueprint real quick. Actually, one thing I want to do before I forget, because we actually want to add a node right here where we clear the tile. So let's go to the tile blueprint real quick. And let's just add this function so I don't forget. So in the event graph, just delete all this stuff, we'll add it back. Just right click, say add custom event, just call it clear letter. And that's fine for right now. I just want to hook this up so I don't forget, because whenever I try to come back and do things like this later where I'm adding a node in between some random location, I always forget. So just right here, after we spawn it, just say clear letter, which is really just clearing the letter value from the tile is what it's going to do. And then let me just add some reroute nodes here so it looks a little nicer. Something like this. Okay, so we create the tile, and then we make sure it's clear, and then we add it to our array. Okay, so let's see here. Yeah, let's go work on our tiles so we can actually see these working. So inside of the tile blueprint, in the viewport tab, let's go over here so we can actually see what we're doing. So we have our default scenery, we want to keep that. So click on that, and then to this we want to add a cube, like so. This is going to be our tile, and we want to make it more of a tile shape. So I'm going to actually change the scale to be 0.001 on all of these, or sorry, just the x-axis. That way we get sort of like a flat looking tile thing. And then since we've scaled it down, we also want to make sure it stays. Actually, let me check something here. Is this yeah, so it's already centered. So we'll just say 0.001. So make sure you have the cube selected, and then we want to add a widget. And we're going to call this the widget back. And then we can actually just duplicate this and call it widget front. So the reason we're adding two widgets here is because these widgets are going to hold the letter like R, S, T, or whatever. And we need two of them because, let me just run my other project real quick. You'll see when I type in a letter and I press enter, it actually flips around and shows the backside. And so the letter needs to be on the front and the back. And we'll make this widget later to actually hold the letter, but for right now, let's just add these like so, and we'll move these around in a little bit. But for now, just set it up like this. And then let's see, let's go back to the event graph, and then inside the begin play, or no, what am I doing here? Hold on, let me just look at my other project for a second. Let's just come back to this one later. Let's just run this and make sure this works first, because we should be able to see the grid with these empty cubes on them, or tiles on them. So let's hit play. Hopefully I didn't forget anything. Looks like I forgot something. So let's go back. What did I forget? All right, so inside of the start round function, inside of the game mode, I forgot to pass in the word length and the number of guesses, and that comes in over here on the left. So we can just drag off the word length, say get word length, and drag off the number of guesses and say get num guesses. Now, if you don't see these here, you might have to right click and refresh this, refresh nodes. So the reason these are showing up now is because inside of the board, we added variables for the word length and the number of guesses, and we set them to expose on spawn. So that's what that does. It makes them show up right here. Okay, so now we're passing this. Let me see, we call in initialize, we are. Okay, so let's try this again. 5, 6. Okay, so there we go. So now we get a board, and it should look like this. You should have 5 columns, and you should have 6 rows. Okay, so let's go back to the tile here, and we need to start. I mean, there's a bunch of different things we can do first. I don't really know which order would be the best, but for now, let's start with making the materials, because we're going to need these materials probably pretty soon anyways. So back here in the content folder, right click. I'm just going to make a new folder for this and call it materials. And these are going to be pretty straightforward. So we're just going to make one material to be the parent, and then we're going to create some children for it. So right click, make a new material, just call it m_base material, and then open this up. And then inside of here, I'm going to hold down 3 and left click to create a constant 3 vector and hook it up to the base color, and then right click and convert it to a parameter and rename it to color. And then I'm also going to hold down 1 and left click to create a scalar value. And I'm just going to leave this at 0 and pass it in for the metallic and the scalar, just so our tiles are not shiny in any way. And then this color, by default, doesn't really matter what you do. I'm going to set it to like some gray color, I guess, and hit apply and save. And so this is just our base color. We're going to use this to create our other materials. So back over in the content folder, right click on this and say create material instance. And we want to call this we need 4 of these. We need one for, well, I'll just start making them. So we need 1, so we're going to call it mi_correct letter. And this one's going to be our yellow one. So this is when they guess a letter that's in the word but not in the right spot. So just make it some sort of yellowish color. And then again, right click, create material instance, mi_perfect letter. So this is when they guess a letter that's in the correct spot. And we'll check this and we'll make it some sort of greenish color, like so. And then we need 2 more. So right click, create material instance. This one's going to be called mi_unsubmitted letter. So this is going to be like the default background color of all the tiles before you submit an entry to it. And for this one, Let's just make it totally black and save. And then we want one more, right click, create material instance, mi underscore submitted letter. I realize I just spelled this other one wrong. Let me just fix this typo. Okay, so submitted letter is a letter that has been submitted, meaning you pressed enter. However, it's not in the word anywhere. So for this one, we just want to make it sort of like a grayish color. And again, you can change these colors to whatever you want if you want different colors, but I'm trying to find something that works. Okay, so we'll go with this slightly lighter gray. So now inside of our BP tile, by default, we want to click on this cube and we want to set the element 0 material to be our unsubmitted letter. So that way they all are black by default. And now if we run this, we should be able to press play and see that they're all black, which is good. Another thing I want to do is, at least for mine, I turned off shadows. If you look over there on the left, you can see the shadows, and it kind of looks weird, especially when they are animating. So to fix that, you can just click on the cube, search for shadow in the details panel, and unclick cast shadow. All right, so next let's start working on giving the player the ability to actually type letters. So we're going to do that inside of our pawn class, just because this is a pretty good place to handle input. So let's see here. Just delete all this stuff, right click and search for any key. So this is an event that gets called whenever you press literally any key. And so what we want to check is if the key that they pressed is a letter. So to do that, we're going to drag off of this key structure here and say get key display name. And we want to check if this is a letter. So this is the other thing we need C++ for, because we want to check that ASCII value. If you remember from before where we checked if it was between like 65 and 90, we want to be able to do that, except it's easier to do that in C++, especially since we already have like the code for it written. So open up the C++ again, and we're just going to add one very small function inside of here. So back in the header file, let's just copy this top line and paste it down here. And then we'll make another function called static bool is letter, and it's going to take in an f string, which is the string, and it returns a bool. So make sure you have it like this. And we're just going to copy and paste this down here. And again, we're going to copy this guy to scope it in. And make sure you remove the semicolon and make sure you remove the static, and then add the open and close brackets. And all we're going to do inside of here is, first of all, we're going to make sure that the string is exactly 1 character long. So if it's not 1 character, then we can safely assume that it's not a letter. So we'll say if string dot length does not equal 1, return false. Otherwise, we want to return if it is an ASCII character. Say is ASCII letter. And to pass in, so this one's a character and we have a string. So in order to do this, we want to say string. And I'm also going to say to upper just to make sure that it is the uppercase version of it. And then get character array. Then we want the first element in the array, which is going to be the first character. So this is what it should look like. Again, this function is pretty simple. It just returns true if this string that gets passed in is a letter and not a number or some sort of weird symbol. And then make sure you save all this, and then back inside of Unreal, make sure you save all this as well before you compile. And then you have to go back to this tab to compile. And then down here, we'll just hit compile. And then hopefully this should work without any issues. If it doesn't, just read through here and figure out what your error is if you can, or rewatch this part. And then we get, okay, so live coding succeeded, so we're good to go. So now back inside of our, where were we? Our tile, I think? No, our player pawn. Yes, back inside of our player pawn, we can finish writing this code. So if we right click, we can search for is letter, and it should show up. You can see it's in our Wordle library, which is our category. So we'll click this. And then we can drag this over here, and it'll do a little conversion for us, which is fine. And then if it's a letter, we'll do a branch here. And so if they did type a letter, we want to basically just tell the game mode about that. So back in our game mode, we want to add a function. So on the left here, we'll add a function, and we'll call it on letter typed. And we want to add an input parameter here for the string, and we'll call it letter. So it's going to call this function, it's going to pass the game mode which letter was pressed. So the first thing we want to check is that the current letter index is less than the word length, and that is basically making sure that if the letter, or if the word is only 5 letters long and they've already typed in all 5 letters, if they try to type another letter, nothing will happen, right? So we'll drag in the current letter index and we'll make sure that it is less than, and here we need to get access to our word length. So that's actually being stored inside of the board. So if we drag in the board and say get, I don't think we have access to it. I think we need to make an accessor, get word. Yeah, we didn't do that yet. So inside the board, come back over here. You can see right here we have the word length. However, we need an accessor for it because we made it private, which is good. So I'll make a function and we'll call it get word length, and we'll just very simply return the word length. And we'll make this pure and constant. If you don't know what these do, I'll just explain it real quick. Constant makes it so that, or constant's basically just telling the computer that this function is not going to change anything about this class or this blueprint, and it helps with optimization. It also helps with organization. And so if you're ever writing a function that's not changing anything about the class, like this is just getting information, you want to make it const. And then pure just makes the function so it doesn't require execution pins. Whenever you see a green node, like for example, this one right here, this is a pure function because it has no execution pins. So it's more of just a design thing, really. And then one other thing I want to do here is I'm going to actually duplicate this, and we're going to make another function that's very similar, except we're going to call it get, what did I call this in my other one? I forget. Get word, keep typing world, get word last valid index. So this is going to come in handy because what this function is going to do here, we'll just write it real quick. So it's just going to return the word length -1. And you might think that that's kind of a stupid function, but it's going to come in handy because we're going to end up wanting this value a lot. And it's nice to just have a function for it as opposed to having to type this out every time. So just go ahead and make these two functions. Just returns the word length. This one just returns the word length -1. And now back in our game mode, we can continue writing this. So for this specific instance, we want just the get word length, and we'll hook that up here. And then we'll drag off of this into a branch. So again, this is just checking that we're not already at the end of the word, because if we're already at the end of the word, we don't want them to type anymore because there's nowhere else to put it. So if that's the case, we want to get the tile at the location where they're currently typing at, and we want to set the letter for it. So to do that, the tiles are all stored inside of the board. So we're going to need to write functionality inside the board for getting a specific tile. So let's go back to the board. I know we're going back and forth a lot, but that's just the way it is. So hit plus here to add a new function. Say get tile. And what this is going to take in is 2 integers. So one, we're going to call it the guess index. So this is essentially which guess they're on, or which row they're on. And we're also going to take in the letter index. And this is obviously which letter they're on in the word. And remember, we have the array of tiles right here. We can get this, but they're all stored sequentially in a row. They're not broken down per guess, right? So we just need to do a little math to figure out which tile we need to return based on these values. So we're going to take the guess index and we're going to multiply it by the word length, which in our case is 5, right? And that's going to get us like the row that we're on. And then we're going to take this value and we're going to add it to the letter index. And this is going to get us the row. So we're essentially getting the row in the column here, more or less, as an index. And then from this, we're going to say get a copy, like so. And this is the tile that is corresponding. Oh, so just to add a return value, just drag off of this and hook it up over here, or drag it over here. You'll get this little green checkbox, and then let go, and it'll add an output pin. Just kind of useful little trick. I'm just going to name it tile. So all this function is doing is it's taking in the guess index that they're on and the letter index that they're on, and they're returning the tile on the board that's associated with that specific guess index and letter index. All right, so now back over here, we can try to continue writing this. So if this is good, then we're going to say board get tile, and then we have the guess index, which is right here, current guess index, and we also have the current level index or letter index, which is right here. So hook up both of those and hook this up to the true. And then from here, we want to take this and we want to set the letter of this tile. So we're going to have to write this function inside of the tile because we want to, when the player presses the T key, we want the tile to show a T on it. So we want to be able to get the tile, and we want to call a function here basically called like set letter. So that's what we're going to do next. So inside of the tile in the event graph, let's add a new custom event. So we'll say add custom event, and we'll call it set letter. And then this needs to take in an input parameter. So add an input parameter of type string, and of course this is going to be the letter. And we want to set this letter on these widgets here. So before we do this, I know we keep going down rabbit holes. Before we do this, we need to be able to actually set the letter on these widgets. So we need to create this widget. So let's go ahead and do that first. So back here in the content folder, right click, user interface, widget blueprint, and select this as the parent, and we will call it letter underscore widget, and then double click on this to open it up. And then on the designer tab here, this is going to be pretty straightforward. The first thing we want to do is just add a canvas panel, and then to that we want to add text like so, and then click on this text here. We first of all want to check the is variable so we can modify it on the graph tab, and we'll just rename it to something more meaningful like letter text. And then we want to change a couple things about this on the right, so make sure you have letter text selected, and then change the anchor point to be the center, and change all of these values. We can just zero these out. We want to set the alignment to 0.5, 0.5, and we want to set size to content to true, and then we'll just change this to be like an R, just so we have an example here. So it should look something like this, and then we also want to change the size of it because 24 is going to be too small, so let's like go 48 is what I used. So it should look like this. You should have a canvas panel, and then this guy basically right here in the middle of it. And then in the graph tab, if we go over here, we want to delete all of this stuff and right click, say add custom event, and we're going to add this event that we want to call from the code that we were just writing. So it's going to be called set letter, and then we want to drag in our letter text, say get, and then drag off this and say set text, and make sure you get this one down here, set text. Hook this up, and then just drag this over here to make an input parameter. I'm just going to rename it to letter, like so. While we're here, let's just go ahead and add a getter for this as well, because we're going to need that. So add a new function, just call it get letter. Oops, let me fix this capitalization, get letter. And then for this, we just want to return the letter, so we can get that from our text block here. So we'll drag us in and say get text, which is this guy. And then I'm just going to use that trick again to add a return node. And there we go. So now we have a very simple set letter and get letter, and it looks like this. So now back in, I think we were in the tile function where we left off. Yes. So inside of set letter, we want to get our front widget. We're going to have to do this for both, but drag in this one first and say get user widget object. And the reason we need to call this weird looking function here is because you got to remember that this variable here is just a reference to the widget component. It's not a reference to the widget itself. So in order to get the widget itself, like the actual user widget that the widget component owns, you need to call this function. And then this just returns a generic user widget. So we want to cast this to our letter widget. And we'll set that up in a second on the left here. But for now, we'll just write this. And then we'll call set letter. And of course, we just want to pass in this guy. Again, we'll do a conversion, which is fine. And then we want to do the same thing for the back widget. So just copy these nodes, paste, and let's see, drag this guy over here, and then make sure you change the back widget as well. So we should have the front widget getting set to the letter, and also the back widget getting set to the letter. And then before we forget, let's click on both of these guys, and then we'll change the widget class to be associated with our letter widget, like so. And then I think we also want to change this. We want to make sure for both of these guys, we select draw at desired size. So it draws at whatever the size, the text that it actually is. And now if we compile and save, we go back to our viewport tab, you can kind of see we have our R here, except it's sort of inside of the block here. So if we take just the front one, you're actually going to have to set this value to something like 100. And the reason you need to set it to like 100 and not just like 1 is because these widgets are actually attached to this cube. And if you remember, we scaled the cube by 0.001. So it's a very tiny scale. So that scale actually applies to these things as well. So for that reason, we're actually setting it to 100, which is really like 0.1 if you think about it that way. I know it's kind of confusing, but it's just the way it works. And then for the back, we want to set it to -100. And we should be able to see the back one now from the back, except for this one, we also want to rotate it. So on the Z, we want to set it to 180. And we also want to rotate this 180 because we actually want it to be upside down so that when it flips around, it will be right side up. So you should have a upside down R on the back that looks like this, and a right side up R on the front that looks like this. And don't worry about this little gray icon. This won't show up in the actual game. It's just the default scene root. All right, so let's see. So we did set letter, and I think this is good. And then let's just write this little node because this will only take a second. So for clear letter, we're just going to call our set letter. So we can just drag in set letter, and we're just going to pass in nothing. So this is how we essentially clear it. All right, so let's go back up. I think we were inside of the pawn is where we originally left off. Yeah, so inside of BP pawn, inside of any key, we sort of left off here. So once they press a key, we make sure it's a letter. And then we need to get access to the game mode to call that onLetter typed function we wrote. So let's do that in begin play. So right click and say begin play. And we're just going to save a copy to our game mode. So we're going to say get game mode. We're going to cast to Wordle game mode. This up. And we're going to take this, promote it to a variable. And we're just going to call it game mode. And we'll make it private. So this way we don't have to cast every single time we want access to it. And we'll drag this in and simply say set, or no, what do we call it? On letter typed. Like this. And then we just want to pass in the letter that we typed, which is obviously this guy here. Like this. All right, so now let's go back to here because we were also in the middle of writing this function. So let's see, on letter typed, we make sure we're not at the end of the word, and then we get the tile that is associated with our current location. And then from here, we want to call that set letter function that we just wrote, and we want to pass in the letter from the input parameter. So we'll just say get letter. And let me make sure, did we write this? Yes, we did. Okay. And then back in our pawn, sorry, I know I'm jumping around a lot. It's right here. So the last thing we want to do is we want to edit the current letter index, right? So when we type a letter, we're originally on letter index 0. When we type a letter, if we type P or something, we then want to go to letter index 1. And then when we type again, we want to go to 2. So we want to make sure that we increment this value right here. So on the left, we'll make a function called edit current letter index. And we'll also use this function whenever we go backwards. So if we press the backspace, we also want to be able to decrement that value. So this is going to take in just one parameter, which is going to be a integer, and we will call it the amount. This is the amount by which we are offsetting this value. So it's either going to be +1 when we type something or -1 when we press the backspace button. And so we're going to take this and we're going to add it to our current letter index, like so. And then we want to make sure that this final result is a valid value still. So we'll say clamp integer. We want to make sure it's in between 0 and whatever the word length is. So we'll say board get word length. Now we're actually going to go one past the end of the board here. So that way, when we press the backspace, it will still work. So that's why we're using the word length and not the last index. And we want to set this to, or we want to set our current letter index to whatever that new value is. So that way, if we pass in 1 here and it was currently 0, it's going to go up to 1, and it's going to go up to 2, but it will make sure that it will never go past the current or the word length, and it will never get less than 0. All right, and then back in our onLetterTyped function, we will call this after we set the letter, and we're going to pass in 1 so it gets incremented. And also, if you want, you can set this to private, since it probably should be. All right, so let's review. So in the player, when the player presses any key, we make sure that the key that he pressed is actually a letter and not a number or a symbol. If it is, we tell the game mode that a letter was typed. And then inside of here, the game mode makes sure that we're not already at the end of the word. And if we're not, then we get the tile that we're currently typing on, and we set the letter to whatever letter we just pressed, and then we increment the current letter index to the next one. So at this point, we should be able to test it. So if we press play and hit this, so let's type like Q, W, E, R, T, and if I hit Y, you can see nothing happened. If I try to type more, nothing happens. Now, obviously, I can't press the backspace yet because we haven't looked that up, but you should at least get your letters showing up based on how you type them, and it should stop once you finish the first row. All right, so let's work on the backspace next so we can actually delete what we type. So back inside of the pawn, we want to add an event here for the backspace. So right click in the event graph and say backspace. So this will obviously get called whenever the player presses the backspace key. And then just like we did for this one where we got the game mode and we said onLetterTyped, we want to get the game mode and we want to say on backspace typed. So in the game mode, we'll make a function called on backspace typed. And then back in our pawn, we will get the game mode and say on backspace typed and hook that up to the pressed so it gets called. And then back inside here, let's actually write this function. So the first thing we want to do is decrement the current letter index. So drag this function in that we just wrote. And then in this time, instead of passing in 1, we're going to pass in -1, so it goes down. And then we want to clear the letter that we're currently on. So we will drag in the board, and we'll use our handy little get tile function that we wrote. And for the current guess index, we will pass in our current guess index. And the letter, we will pass in the current letter. And then we want to use that clear letter function that we already have written to clear it. All right, so now if we go ahead and we run this again, press play, and we start typing. So I'm going to type QWERT again. If I press backspace, you can see it goes back, 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 back. And if I spam it back a bunch and then start typing again, it just works. So it should work as you expect without any issues, and you should still be confined to this top row. All right, so next we want to be able to submit the words by pressing enter. So back in our pawn class, let's add another event for enter. So enter, or maybe it's called event enter. There we go. This one is obviously going to get called when you press the enter key. And then just like we did for everything else, we're going to make a function in the game mode. So back in the game mode, I'll add another function, and we will call this one submit word. And then inside of here, we will get the player controller, and we're going to call set input mode to UI only. And the reason we're doing this is so that the player's input is actually disabled, at least his game input is disabled, like typing, because once you enter the word, it needs to play an animation, like the words are flipping around and changing colors. And while that animation is playing, we actually don't want them to be able to type anymore, because well, we want them to watch the animation and see the results. They shouldn't be able to start typing until that animation finishes and they figure out which letters they got correct and which ones they got incorrect. So like I said, set input mode UI only. And then after that, we want to get the current word. So whatever they typed, and figure out if that current word is valid or not. So to do that, we're going to have to make a function over here on the left. So new function, call it get current word. And what this function is going to do is essentially just loop over whatever the current row they're in and grab the letter value from each one of the tiles and make a word out of it and check if it's valid. So inside of here, we want to loop over each one of those words. So we will right click and say for loop. And again, make sure you get this one. And what we're looping over is, like I said, the length of the word. So we'll say, where is our board? We'll say board, get word length. Or actually for this one, we want to use the get word last valid index, since we only care about that, or we don't want the full length. We just want we want to go up to the last index basically. And then we want to say, get board again. We want to say, get the tile at this specific location. For the letter index, it's going to be our index in our array. And our guess index is going to be our current guess index, like so. And then actually what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take these nodes here, everything but the function name, and make it into a macro, because we're actually going to use this in another spot later. So if we take this and right click and just say collapse to macro, and then, oops, let me undo that. I clicked function instead of macro. Right click, collapse to macro, and we will just rename this to for each current tile. And then let's just go inside here and fix this real quick. So inside of here, we just want to hook this up like so. We want to also output the tile, and we want to output the index, and we want to output the complete node as well. And I'm going to rename this first one here to be the loop body, so it looks like a normal for loop would. And then let me just rearrange some of these nodes here so it doesn't look so horrific. 1 second. That goes there. And this one goes this way. Okay, now we can see much more easily where everything is going. Pile and save this. And now back inside of our get current word function, we have something that looks like this here. So this looks like a normal for each loop, except it's specifically looping over just the tiles that are in our current word. All right, so for each tile, we want to get the letter. Of course, we haven't written that function yet. Let's just go ahead and write this one real quick. So inside of our tile, this one will just take a second. Just make a function over here called get letter. And if you remember, the letter is actually being stored inside of the widget, and it's actually being stored inside of both of these, the front and the back. Did my Unreal just freeze? So my Unreal just crashed, so I had to restart everything. So I'm just gonna redo the part that I lost. It was only a couple little nodes here and there because I don't remember what I've already recorded. But I think I already did this part, but if I didn't, do it again. So inside BP pawn, I'm gonna add the enter event. So event enter. Again, I think I already just did this with you guys, but I think I lost it when my Unreal crashed. So we'll say game mode, submit word, when we press enter, like so. And then let's see, so back inside submit word, so it saved this, and we were working on this get current word function. And where were we? Get current word. Okay, so we got this macro created, which has this stuff in it. Okay, so that part's saved. So we were just working on the get letter function inside of the tile. So back inside of the tile, yeah, like I was saying, so make a function over here on the left and call it, or that's not a function on the left, and call it get letter. And like I was saying before, oops, that's part of the other one, sorry. So the letter is actually stored inside of our widgets, and it's stored inside of both of them. So we really only need to get one. It doesn't really matter which one. So I'll just drag in the front and say get user widget object, which again gets us the actual widget. And we will cast to our letter widget so we can get access to the actual letter inside of it. And we will call the get letter function that we've written. This function should probably be pure constant. Actually, let me double click on this guy and change this to be pure const since it's just a getter. File save, and then back here, now it's pure const. And we want to return this value, except we want to return it as a string, not a text. So in the output value, add a output pin of type string and just call it letter, and then hook this up like so, and hook this up to there, and the conversion is again fine. Okay, so now back in, let's see, back in our pawn, submit word, right, back inside of get current word, inside of the Wordle game mode, we now want to call get letter. Oh, oops, this one should also be pure const. I always forget to do this. So click on this pure const, since it's just an accessor. And then back in our game mode, now it's pure const. First thing we want to check is if it is a letter, which is that function we've written in C++, we'll call this again. And if it is not Boolean, then we're going to do a branch here. So if it's not a valid letter, which in our case means that they haven't filled anything into that box yet, which means that, you know, if it's a 5-letter word that they've only typed like 2 or 3 letters, they haven't actually finished typing it yet. If that's the case, then this branch here will be true. And we want to return that this is invalid. So for this function here, let's add an output parameter for whether or not the word is valid. And we also, since it's called get current word, we also want to return the word itself as a string. And we'll just call it current word. So in this branch up here at the top, again, like I said, if we get to this case here and it's true, that means that they haven't filled in the full word yet. So we just want to return valid as false, and we just want to leave the current word as empty. And remember, this is inside of a loop. So otherwise, if this letter is set to something, then we want to add it to our submitted word. So we're going to make a local variable down here and call it the submitted word local. And we'll make it a string. And so by default, it's just going to be empty. And then as we loop over each tiles, we're going to add to it. So we're going to drag this in. We're going to say append. We're going to hook up our letter here. And we're going to say set, like so. So as we're looping over the tiles in this row, we're going to be appending to this string, which will eventually give us the word that the player has typed into those tiles. So if we make it through this loop without this return happening, that means we have tiles that all have letters in them. It doesn't necessarily mean that the letters spell a word. It just means that they've typed letters into all of the boxes before they've pressed enter. So now we need to check if the words or the letters they've typed actually form a valid word. So to do that, we want to grab the board and we want to get the word length. And we want to get all the words of this word length. So over here, we can drag on our words. And remember how we separated these so that they're stored in a map where the key is the length of the word. So to get all the words of this length, we can just say find and pass in the word length as the key. And then this, if we break it here, this will return to us all of the words of this length, because there's no reason to check if the word is in the list. There's no reason to check, like if our word is apple, there's no reason to check words that are only 3 letters long or that are 12 letters long. We only need to check the words that are 5 letters long, so that way it's a little bit quicker. Now, and we're just going to check if it contains our submitted words. We'll say contains and drag us in. And so this basically will tell us if the word we typed is a valid word, because we're checking if it's inside of that master list, that text file that we have. Now, I just want to say that there is a better way to do this, and that would be a binary search. Since these letters or these words are alphabetically sorted, you could pretty easily in C++ or even in Blueprints, if you wanted to do it that way, you could create a search function to binarily search through the list to check if the word is in there. I didn't want to go into that in this tutorial because it would take a little while and the tutorial was already pretty long, but I just wanted to throw that out there that I know this is not the fastest way to do this by looping over every single word. However, it is plenty fast for this example, and you could very easily take this little chunk of code here and replace it with your binary search function if you wanted to write one of those yourself, if you know how, or if you want to look for a tutorial on that. You could optimize it if you need to optimize it, because this is definitely not the fastest way to do it. It's just quick to do it this way in terms of the tutorial. Okay, and now we can just return this value. So if it's in this array, that means it's a valid word. So we will return this, and we will also return the submitted word, like so. And then we want to make sure we hook up this return node back to the completed tab, like this. All right, so this function very simply just gets us the word that they've typed, and it also tells us if it is valid or not. So now back inside of submit word, let me go back to my other project. My other project got all messed up too when things crashed, so that's just how it is. So back inside of submit word, oh, actually, this needs to be an event because we're going to be doing delays inside of here to do the animation. So actually, just cut these two nodes here and delete this function. Yeah, that's fine. We'll fix that later. File save. And then back in the event graph is where we want to add it. So right click, say add custom event, call it submit word. If it doesn't let you name it this, it's because you need to compile first after deleting that old function. So submit word, and then paste back our setting of the input mode to UI only. Again, this is so that the player cannot type while the words are being validated. And then here is where we want to call our get current word function. And we want to check if, first of all, it is valid. Because if it's not valid, we just kind of want to make the words shake and let the user know that they didn't enter a valid word. So let's do the invalid case first. So for the valid case, we're just going to do a print string and call it valid. And then I guess for right now, so we can test it real quick, we'll do a invalid print string. And then since we deleted that function, we got to fix that. I think it's inside of BP pawn. Or actually, I think it's good because we renamed it the same thing. But make sure inside of your BP pawn that it still compiles and that you have this hooked up to the enter. So they press enter. Let me just review this. So they call submit word. We set the input mode to UI only. We get the current word and we make sure it's valid. Okay, let's just test this real quick and try typing in some words and see what it thinks. So let's try apple. Okay, so it said invalid. So something is clearly not working. Let me check. Okay, so after a little bit of debugging, I realized that the problem is inside of the BP board, get word last valid index. I forgot to put a 1 here. So find this function, and I think I said to do it, but I obviously did not do it. Make sure you have a -1 here. And then let's try this again. Let me just remove my, I don't even know where I was. Hold on, let me just run this real quick so I can remove my breakpoints. Just ignore everything you're seeing. Okay, let's try this again. So I type apple. Let me redo this. I type apple. We get valid. Let me try. Okay, so backspace apparently doesn't work. Why is backspace not working? Oh wait, actually that's fine. It's because when we submit the word, I forgot we're turning off the input mode. So that's fine. So hold on, let's test this again. So you should be able to type like a couple letters, or you should be able to type out full letter and then press backspace. You should be able to press backspace until you press the submit key. So let's try something that's not a valid letter or a valid word. And it says invalid. Okay, but now we're stuck, right? Because we need to set the input mode back after we submit things. So the validation appears to be working. Let's handle the invalid case first because it's actually a little bit easier. So for this one, we can reuse this for each current tile. And what we want to do is just shake the tiles so that it kind of looks like you entered something invalid. So let me just show you if you forget from my other project. If I type in something invalid and I press enter, you see how it kind of shakes? So that's basically what we're about to do. So we want to loop over each tile and we want to tell the tile to do its shaking thing. And then once we're finished, we'll want to wait a second and then re-enable the input. So we can do that part real quick. So we'll just say delay for however long you want to delay after they press enter. I'll just say half a second and then we'll set the input mode back to game only. So we'll say get player controller and set input mode game only. And now we just need to write a function inside of our tile for having it shake. So inside the tile, we will add a custom event. So we'll say add custom event. And we will call this the error letter. And inside of here, we want to add a timeline. So we'll say timeline. And we'll call this the error timeline. And we want to hook this up to play from start. And then inside of here, we want to add some shaking effect. So we're going to set the length to 1, and then we're going to add a float track. And then we're going to add a node to the start and the end, roughly. We're going to set this one, we're going to set both of these to a value of 0.5 on the y-axis. The left one we want to be at 0, and the right one we want to be at 1. And then to do shaking, we just need to make it go up and down here. So right click, we'll add a new one up here. We'll set this one to 0.25 and 1. And then we'll make one down here at a time of 0.5 and a value of 0, like this. And then we will add one more up here with a value of 0.75 or a time of 0.75 and a value of 1. This will basically be the shakiness of it. And then back in the event graph, actually, let's rename this to be alpha. That's just always the value I use. And back in the event graph, we want to take in the cube here, and we want to set its relative location, so it looks like it's shaking. So we'll say set relative location. This will go inside the update. And we want to move it from left to right. So if you look at the cube here, we basically want it to do this, right? So this is moving on the y-axis. So back over here in the event graph, we will say alert vector, and this will hook up to our new value. And so we want to interpolate between a value of -10 on the y and a value of +10 on the y based on whatever this alpha value is. And then I think that is the only thing we need to do here. And then back in our game mode, we will just call error letter and hook this up to the loop body. So now if we give this another try, we run it and we type in some garbage, we press enter, you can see it plays the shaky effect. Now it's a little slow right now. If you want to increase the speed of it, you can just go back to your tile blueprint and then in the begin play, or actually, you might be able to do it over here. No, I guess you can't. In the begin play, just drag in the error timeline and say get and say set play rate. So this is essentially how fast it's going to play. not how long it's going to take, but how fast it's going to play. So if you want it to play 3 times faster, you just put a 3 right here. And then I think that's what I used in my other video. So if we try it again, type garbage, press enter, now we get a nice fast shake. Okay, so now we need to make it so we can actually, oh wait, it is working. For entering invalid letters, we press enter, we can press backspace, and it works. But I think if we type a valid word and press enter, we still can't press backspace because we still have the input disabled. So we basically just need to handle the correct input and do the color changing, and then just the quick little game over menu, and we should be done. So we will handle that in the next part. So I'll see you guys in the next video.